Confrontation. Any idea what they're planning? I asked Cheater when we returned to our table. We'd gotten sandwiches today. Apparently, there had been some problems with the ovens. They'd all gone out right before first period. I guess Torchy really had doused every fire in the place. At least the workers had noticed the problem before the place filled with gas. Rumble, Cheater said. I glanced over to Bloodbath's table. He was talking to a whole bunch of thugs who clustered around him. He's not that stupid, I said. If he starts a riot right in front of the inspectors, he'll just get tossed out of here. No reason for us to stop him. Life at Edgeview would be almost bearable without Bloodbath. As I spoke, a couple of the thugs left their group. They each sat down at a different table. More of them did the same thing, spreading out around the cafeteria. I think they're going to start a bunch of fights, Flinch said. Oh no, Torchy said. Look who's headed here. Bloodbath was the last to get up, had left his table. He was heading right towards us. I looked around. His gang was spread out among tables. Even Lip had picked a spot, with the smallest of the runts, of course. Maybe it was stupid of him to split up his group, but even with the 6 of us against him, I didn't want to tangle with Bloodbath. Any ideas? I asked the guys at the table. That's when I noticed Trash. He was staring at Grunge, who was at the table to our left. Trash's teeth were clenched. He had a look on his face like, well, there's no polite way to put it. He looked like someone who hadn't been able to go to the bathroom in 3 or 4 days and was trying to get it over with real hard. After a moment, he switched his attention to another of the thugs. Hey, Torchy said, what are you doing, Trash? Shh, I said, let him concentrate. Hello, friends, Bloodbath said. Do you mind if I join you? He dropped into a seat between Cheater and Torchy, grinned at us, and then glanced at the clock on the wall. Cheater raised his hands and fists and flashed his fingers opened and closed. He did it twice. 20. That's what he was telling me. I checked the clock. It was 17 minutes after 12. I figured Bloodbath had picked a time when they'd all leap into action. 20 after. I tensed, getting ready for the fight. Maybe I could jump on him before he really hurt Cheater. If I grabbed his arms, I might be able to slow him down until he shook me off. Tick. The clock moved to 12:18. Trash lowered his head. He seemed to be staring at the table. Hey, Bloodbath said, looking across the table at Trash. What's wrong with you? Leave him alone, I said. I had no idea what Trash was doing, but this was no time to let him be disturbed. Tick. 12:19. Guess what? You're about to get hurt, Bloodbath said. All of you, and it's going to be a pleasure. I stared back, ready to dive at him when the clock ticked. He didn't know that I knew. Maybe that would make a difference. I just hoped that Cheater figured out that he needed to run for the door. Time crawled. I could almost feel the seconds trudging past. I thought of those dying flies that drag themselves across the ceiling at the start of winter. Tick. Bloodbath leapt from his seat and lunged towards Cheater to his right. He tried to lunge, that is. As his body snapped to a halt, he got the weirdest look on his face. So did the rest of his gang. They all fell down at once. I'd already jumped out of my chair. Now, as I stood there, braced to leap to Cheater's defense, I realized that there wasn't going to be a fight. The table jerked as Bloodbath yanked his leg. I peeked around, already suspecting what had happened. Bloodbath's sneaker lace was tied around one of the legs that jutted from the base of the table. Bloodbath was swearing in frustration now. Principal Davis and the teachers had run over to the flailing thugs. They got the kids back on their feet and tried to lead them from the room. The whole group was stuck until someone suggested they remove their sneakers. Wow, good work, I said, looking over at Trash. It was you, wasn't it? Yeah, he nodded. His face was barely above a whisper. He looked pretty wiped out. For a moment, his eyes flickered. I reached towards him, afraid he was going to pass out, but he shook his head hard once, then opened his eyes all the way. I thought about the old Trash, beaten down by the world. He was nothing but a memory. That was really cool, I said. I reached out and clasped his shoulder. Trash smiled. Thanks. Across the room, the inspectors were all sitting at a table talking to each other. Several of them kept glancing at their watches, even though there was a clock on the wall. Looks like a good spot for you, Cheater, I said. Cheater got up and sighed. It'd be a lot less terrifying than getting close to Bloodbath. He walked over to the inspector's table. Excuse me, he said, do you have any salt? Then he leaned between the two of them, reaching for the salt. He grabbed the shaker and walked back toward us, staggering like someone who had just run face first into a lamppost. Wow, he said, shaking his head hard. What? I said, did you get anything? He dropped back into his chair. I'll tell you, adults sure have a lot of junk rushing through their heads. Oh, give me a minute. I waited while Cheater sat with his eyes closed. Finally, he took a deep breath and opened his eyes. Okay, according to what I picked up, 2 of them want to recommend that the state should close Edgeview. 2 want it open, and the other 2 haven't made up their minds yet. They're almost done with everything on their list. The final thing they want to do is talk to a typical student. After that, they'll make their final decision. Just one student? Flinch asked. What's the point? Cheater shrugged. They have to get back to the Capitol for a meeting. They don't have time to talk to a lot of kids. They figured one would be better than none. Actually, you can learn a lot more than you'd expect from a small sample properly chosen from a large group. So, it could all depend on who they pick and what he says. I looked around the cafeteria at the mass of trouble that passed for students at Edgeview. Oh, we're dead. Any idea who they're planning to talk to? Lucky asked. Cheater shook his head. I don't know. That's when Principal Davis returned to the cafeteria. He went over to the inspectors and handed them a stack of paper. One of the inspectors pulled out a sheet from the stack. He passed it to the woman next to him. She closed her eyes and stabbed at it with a finger, then said something to Principal Davis. As he leaned over her shoulder and looked down at the paper, his expression changed. He frowned and shook his head. His face reminded me of someone who had just lost a big bet. He scanned the cafeteria, and then he headed towards our table. Oh, what did I do this time? I wondered. Principal Davis came right up to me. Martin? Yes? I really wish it was someone else, just about anyone else, but our guests would like to speak with you after lunch. Me? I really couldn't believe this. Unfortunately, I would have suggested someone more pleasant, but they picked you. Come to the office when the bell rings. I was too stunned to say anything. I just sat there and watched him walk away. Anyone but me. I thought all I had to do was spend 10 minutes in a room with the inspectors, and they'd probably decide to call in an airstrike to wipe Edgeview off the map. At the very least, they'd probably boot me out immediately, no matter what the regulations might be. Do you really care what happens to Edgeview? Lucky asked me. I thought about Principal Davis and his punishments. I thought about Mr. Parsons and his anger, but I also thought about Mr. Briggs and his passion for teaching, and Miss Nomad, who cared too much, and Miss Crenshaw, who tried to make classes interesting, and I thought about all the kids who needed some place in the system, and I nodded. A strange smile flitted across Lucky's lips. Personally, I wouldn't bother, but if that's what you want, then it's time to use your power, Martin. All right. And here we have a draft of a report by Dr. Lenore Harper on the status of the state's alternative schools. So this Dr. Harper person is one of the inspectors that's at Edgeview. And this is like a rough draft of her report right here. The minimal success of the current alternative schools leaves us with a tough decision. There seem to be 3 available choices. 1. Leave the system in place for another 5-year test period. Advantage, the staff will gain experience. Disadvantage, the system has done little to improve the dropout rate or address the needs of these students. 2. Merge the 4 existing schools into one program. A suitable building is available. Advantage, this move will save money. Disadvantage, some parents will have to travel a greater distance to visit their children. 3. Abandon the alternative school approach. Advantage, substantial savings that can be spent elsewhere. Disadvantage, there's no place else for these students to go.